All right, so this is the first lab, if you will. Basically, what I want you to do is light and render the scene. The idea of this is to think of something like if you've ever taken a drawing or painting course or still life, they often have you do still life paintings, right, or drawings, or whatever. I don't know if you've taken any of those, but that's what you do, and it's something that even old master, Renaissance, and whatever artists that they would do. Photography students do it as well, but basically the idea is that you just put a bunch of things on a table, and then you render them in some way. So we're gonna do the same thing, but we're gonna do it in 3D because this is all about creating a nice looking piece. Okay, so more or less just going to try and cover the basics here of just basic applying materials, using basic lighting, and that sort of thing, just to kind of get started with a little bit of Arnold, and then we're going to switch this week, and then switch gears next week. We're just going to go straight into texturing and then come back to Arnold again. So this is kind of just an overall kind of thing. We're not going to really do any texturing beyond applying textures. We're not going to really make any. Okay, boom. Okay, so first off, you're going to open up the scene. You can see basically it's just a box here that I have set up, and I put some objects here that are meant to represent more or less the still life. Okay, that's the idea behind it. Okay, let's do a little bit cleanup, because right now if I try to click on anything, you're gonna see I'm gonna keep clicking on that building because that's actually in front of our stuff. So what you want to do is select it, go to the channel box, click on this or the tab, click on the ball and paper, go ahead and just rename it, like, I don't know, room walls, so that we know what it is. Badoop. And then I am just going to go ahead and click that twice to make it reference. And now I can't click on it, and I can click on my items in here if I should need to. Huzzah. Alright, that looks pretty okay. What do we want to do next? Okay, so what I'm going to do, so when you go to texture things, you kind of have to test them in their actual rendered state. That's why I was going to throw materials on there, but without actually seeing them rendered, you don't really know what it looks like. Like, you might make something red, but you don't really know what kind of red that is until it's being lit. A red shirt inside looks different than a red shirt outside, so you have to light the scene before we do that. And to do it, we're just going to do a couple really simple lights, and we're just going to use Arnold to start with. Actually, before I even do that, what I want to do is I want to take everything in here, and I just want to apply the basic Arnold shader. Right now it has Lambert, which is totally fine. Lambert would work. I just want to make everything straight Arnold, alright? So, if I go to my Hypershade, which is this blue ball here, you go to Windows, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, same thing. And it's going to be over here. If you have two monitors, that's really the way to go, because I'm going to be struggling with real estate as far as this stuff is concerned. So I have a couple of things here. Let's get rid of these. These shouldn't be there. Okay. So right now everything is Lambert. It's one material. They're all applied there. If I click over here and I'm on Maya, and then I just go to surfaces, these are all the shaders that are built into Maya. Okay. Some of them are very specific. They do a very specific thing, like ocean shaders, obviously very specifically for ocean. It comes with a displacement map, so it actually creates waves and things like that. Surface shader, right? It just, use background. We'll just go ahead and use the background, so it'll catch shadows and specular highlights and things like that, but it won't actually create its own color or anything like that. That sort of thing. So but for the most part, we usually use Lambert or Blinn. For our normal, if we're doing a Maya software render. And those will work inside of Arnold, but it would be better just to kind of stick to Arnold for this just because. So instead of the Maya ones and surface, I'm going to go to Arnold and go to shader. It's the same thing. And we're going to do the AI standard surface. Okay, so just click on that to make a standard surface. And I'm just going to call this default _ MAT for material. I just named it over here. And I'm just going to leave it right like that. That's fine. I don't really care about it beyond that. So I'm just going to go ahead and just apply that to everything. So the easiest way is to click and drag over all of it. I'm going to right click over top of this and hold and go to Assign Material Selection. Boom, now everything in there has it. I'm going to also do that to the walls. So I'm going to select the walls. And actually, I'll just middle mouse button, click, and drop it onto the wall. Okay, so now everything has that material. Like I said, it doesn't actually matter that whether they have those. I just want to do this to begin with. So I'm just going to go ahead and set the walls back to referenced. So that is good. And so now everything's got those materials. If I go to render just by default in Arnold, this is what you're going to get. And can you guess what it's going to be? Black. Because if you have no lights, you can't see anything, right? If I turn the lights off in the room. So I'm just going to escape to stop that. And we're going to throw a couple of lights in. Now, if you look at most of these still lifes, typically what they end up having is they have like some sort of interior light, and they almost always look like there's a window, right? Like there's windows. There's lights coming in from outside, and then there's some sort of like interior fill light. So we're literally just going to use 2 lights. I'm going to use a light that's going to represent more or less light coming from the left to the right, and then one above, kind of to the right, that's just going to be like my interior light. And that's what we're shooting for. Should be pretty simple. Let's put these back. Okay. So, so usually I like to do things with just the practical lights to start with, and we're also going to just go ahead and use Maya lights this time. Some of the Maya lights do not work. If you've used Maya lights before, they work with Maya software, but they won't necessarily work in this. So, but we're just going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and create lights, and then I'm going to go ahead and use a spotlight, and it's going to put it, I'm going to hit W. You can see it's really tiny because, well, it's actually, I'm going to hit R to scale just so I can see it a little bit better. There you go, now I can see it. And because you got to remember that the grid that's down here, that's in centimeters. So if you make something to actual scale, it's actually going to look really large compared to normal. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to hold J as I rotate this so that it rotates in increments. And I'm just going to put it up and act like this is my my like indoor light. That's what I'm thinking here. Okay, I'm going to go like that. Now, I can't really actually see it, right? So what I can do is click on this guy. That'll turn lighting on. And then if I click on this, it'll turn shadows on. And if you want, you can turn on this, and that'll do the ambient occlusion. Don't honestly really need that. Now, if I hit render, again, it's going to probably be black. We might get something. I don't think we will, but we'll see. And it looks like black. And that's because basically it's just not strong enough. It needs to be much, much stronger in order to work. Now in Maya, this would work right off the bat. But the thing is with Arnold is that it's a PBR render. You might have heard PBR. It just means a physically based renderer. And so it's meant to be accurate. It's meant to look like to behave like a real world, this is how it would look. So it's very good at doing real world renders, most specifically. It's not to say you can't get a stylized look out of it, but it's going to be more based on realism. Okay, so we need to basically strengthen this up and make some adjustments. So with it selected, I'm going to go to the attribute editor, and then we have our settings here. So I have spotlight. And we'll just work our way from the top down. So color, I'm going to click on the color and boop. And I'm just going to do kind of add a little bit of yellow to it. You know, just so it's a little bit like a cream. It looks a little bit nicer. I'm going to take my decay rate. So, yeah, I'll show you the decay first. So no decay means it just goes on forever. But the thing is, like, that's not actually accurate because light, I mean, if you point a flashlight out, right, into the dark, it doesn't just illuminate forever, right? I mean, you might have a laser or something like this, like that. It actually decays, meaning it has a fall off. After a certain amount of time, it can only go so far. So it's actually quadratic. That's the formula that's the most accurate. Linear, it will decay, but not that quickly. And cubic will decay quicker than actual. We're going to go ahead and I'm just going to do linear. So at least it does a little bit, but it's not going to be nuts. And then I'll take my intensity and let's do like 2000. All right. And then cone angle is the size of this. So if you see, ooh, right? So I'm just going to make that up. You do have to be worried or concerned with making the cone angle too wide. The wider you get it, the light becomes perpendicular to the side walls here and also down here. And what ends up happening is you get this weird stepping. It's like a weird aberration. It's something to do with the algorithms, the way they work. Although it might not happen as much in Arnold. I know it used to happen in other renders. Okay, so I'm just going to up the cone angle. Penumbra is the fall off, so I don't know if that's actually going to show up. Okay, so you see, basically it's like the feathering in this direction. You can probably, right here. So basically it's the little blurring of the edges. So if I go like that, if I go inwards, it'll cut inwards. So we'll just go to 10, I guess. And drop off is from the center out. So I'll add a little bit. Let's do like 0.1. So it does a little bit, but just to add a little pizzazz. Okay. Now, if I go to render, I think it still is not going to show anything. Let's see. Might. But it's probably going to be a little bit weak sauce if it does. Okay, so it still doesn't. So the reason for that is that that's still not strong enough for Arnold. So we're going to go down. This is the basic. This works inside of Maya and everything else that you've seen. But there's actually a tab just for Arnold because it's so special. So you'll notice that up here, I did a color. You can actually use color temperature. And basically, this thing here is kelvins. And there's actually a, it's the way that scientists measure the color temperature, the color, basically, of light. Okay? And so the idea is that the longer the wavelength of light, the more red it is. And the shorter, the more blue. So typically, if they're longer, it means less energy. It's kind of like how the Doppler effect, it's basically like the Doppler effect, you know, when you hear an ambulance come towards you, it sounds like wee, 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 but as it goes away, it goes woo, woo, woo. It's because it's lengthening out. That's why at sunset, you might notice that the sun will look orange or the sky will be red. It's because the sun is actually hitting more atmosphere, at least as far as you're concerned, because now it's across the way, and so it lengthens the bands of light. Anyway, that doesn't really matter to you. If I go to the left, it's going to make it more orange. I don't think it's going to preview it. And if I go to the right, it's going to make it more blue. So I'm going to, I don't know, we'll leave it around 60. Exposure. Whoop. Okay, I'm going to go up to 5. I think that's the one that's going to make it actually work. So let's go ahead and hit render now. More or less, that's kind of a multiplier, if you will, inside of Arnold for the strength attribute of it. But at 0, right, if you multiply it times 0, it's going to be nada. So what I would do is you kind of look at, like, you can play around with the two numbers and then kind of decide what you think, you know, one needs more than the other. Okay, so we're going to call that good enough. I don't really care. So let's do, maybe I did 7. I can't remember what I put in there before. Let's do 7. My dog is jumping on the window. The rest of this is fine. The samples will basically increase the quality, but we're going to leave that alone because it'll make it take longer to render. All right. So that looks okay. One of the issues that we're going to have, though, is that you can see it takes a really long time for it to render. And what we can do is we could do things where we would go into our render settings. You hit this little thing up here. And then I would go and I could change the size of it. I can make this really small, so it's just a little picture. And so it'll render a bit faster, but it's harder to see. We could lower just the render quality settings inside of Arnold itself in order to kind of improve that. But there's another tool that it has that's really cool that I think we're going to use instead. So I'm going to turn that off. If you go to rendering and you go to Arnold, you go to the render. It has its own render window. Oops, it'll probably pop out here. Let me stop that. Okay, it'll pop out here. I'm just going to take mine and snap it right there. So that way I can see what I'm doing over here as I'm doing stuff over there. Okay. Now, once you do that, mine automatically started doing this, so don't get confused by that. You might want to turn on render and click on run IPR. And what that's going to do is it's going to constantly render the scene, but like in waves. So at least you get, it'll be a crummy quality, but you can kind of see what you did pretty with some immediacy, which is kind of nice. Now, if you notice your computer is really bogging down, especially if you have, like, let's say a laptop and you have to worry about temperature, it might be something that you want to, maybe turn off and just click on it. Because you might have noticed when you go to render, it'll render out complete blocks. I like this better because it kind of evolves and I can see it as I'm going. There are settings and stuff to kind of help with some of this. Okay. So let's get closer, because, all right, here we go. This was the, all right. All right, so that looks okay. I'm going to, let me see, where's the color temperature? I want to bring that down just a little bit more. So I'll make it a little bit more yellow. Okay, I'm going to leave that one for now. I might have to make some adjustments, but I'm going to call that good as far as the inside light. Because the inside light's actually, in most of these, you'll notice it's actually pretty dark. It's just kind of a yellow, warm light to kind of fill. What I'm going to do now is actually make my window light. So a window, if the light's coming in, obviously if you're outside, you want the light to be like a directional light. But for a window, in this kind of scenario, and because I want to create the reflections on the glass and stuff, I'm just going to go ahead and use an area light. So I'm going to go to Create, Lights, and we're going to go to Area Light. And it's going to be down here, so I'm going to pop this guy up. So you can see it's hurting my performance a little bit. I mean, it's not terrible, but it definitely does make my computer chug a little. But my computer is also kind of old. I need to update it, but I'm poor. Yo soy muy pobre, and, my kids like pizza too much. So I end up spending all my money on that. All right, let's see. All right, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this light, and I'm going to kind of balance it like this. Alright. Now there are Arnold specific lights. I'm not going to get into that today. We might get into that later. For now, we're just going to use the basic Maya ones that are built in. Let's go ahead. I'm going to scale this up this way a little bit more. But I'm trying to basically have this light that's going to cast its light across this way. Now, I'm going to go ahead and turn off this lighting and shadows because, quite frankly, it's not giving me an accurate preview anyways, because it's previewing what it would look like for Maya, not for Arnold, obviously. So, let's do a linear decay. Again, let's see. And let's do, I don't know, I don't think this is going to make a difference. We'll do 2000 on that. Go to Arnold. And again, I'm going to use color temperature. This time, it's meant to imitate the outside. So if you're inside, typically the lighting actually, I know it seems odd because like the sun is yellow, but typically inside, the lighting's actually a little bit more on the red, yellow, orange spectrum. And outside, it's a little more on the blue spectrum. Okay, so I'm actually going to take this color temperature and go to the right with it. And I can't even see it anyway. So let me take the exposure up to like 5. There we go. So now you can kind of see that kind of upped the game a little bit. Let's go. Can we do 10 or is that too bright? That's too bright. Too bright. Let's try 7. That's what I think I did with the other one. Okay. And yeah. All right. So not the greatest, but you can try playing around with these numbers and stuff. But the nice thing is because I use that area light, and I'm going to go ahead and let it emit specular, which is going to put on these like highlights here. But you can see it's going to give me those nice little little window looking highlights and stuff that I kind of wanted to go along with the rest of my stuff here. So everything right now has that, like, it looks like some sort of, I don't know, plasticine, like ceramic looking kind of thing. So all right. So we've got a basic lighting, and once we throw materials on there, we might have to adjust these, but at least we have kind of something going on. All right, so we'll call that good for now. So because basically I just did some main lights. I did the, like I said, the one coming down and then the one coming across, and we're going to call that good. The nice thing is, because it's a physically based render, there's light bouncing all over the place, just like it does in real world, so I don't have to really make any of those supporting lights, the reflective lights and things like that. You might need to in some cases, but for this, I think this looks fine, so I'm not as concerned. All right, So we have that going on. Now let's go through and start making our materials so that we can go from there. Okay, so call that good. So the materials, I'm going to go to the Hypershade like we did before. Little blue ball there. It's going to take forever. All right. And we will just work our way up here. So let's go ahead and do the tablecloth. So again, I'm just going to go to Arnold. I'm going to go to Shader. And we're just going to use the one shader. You'll notice that, again, there are a bunch of different shaders in here. But we don't really need any of these. Some of these are made for specific things, like this car paint one. That one's kind of obvious. There's a tune one. That's also kind of obvious. Oh, man. Dude, my dog is chewing on everything. There's for specific things. But just like inside of Maya, the software renders where there's, a bunch of different ones, but really I always just use blend for everything. We're just going to go ahead and use standard surface for everything. So I'm going to click on standard surface, and that's fine. I didn't do anything yet, but I'm going to go ahead and bring this over. Okay, so let's go ahead and rename this, and we'll just call it tablecloth, cloth underscore MAT for material. Okay, now basically there are a bunch of attributes in here that are going to control the way that the material will render itself, okay? So, some of them are pretty obvious, some of them are less so. I'm going to try and go through these really quick because I don't want this video to be, 12 hours long. But what you will notice is that on every one of these, so there are some primary things here. I wonder if this would be, I'm going to minimize this. Yeah, I think it's a little bit easier to see over here. So I'm just going to use the attribute editor. So you're going to notice that there's a couple of these that are important. So basically these four here are the four main ones that you have to concern yourself with. These other ones do things that are important, but like not many things are going to emiss, right? They're not gonna shoot out light, right? That's a very specific thing. Whether it has a coat, So really it's these four main ones. But what you're going to notice on each one of them, they have a weight value. And so what it is that, so for instance, this transmission, this is for transparency. If I put a weight of 1, that's going to mean that it's going to apply, whatever the settings are in here are going to be applied to it. But if I want it to be 100% not, opaque, not transparent, I'd make it 0. Same thing with specular. If I want it to be just a flat color, I just take the weight and make it 0. So these are kind of, the weight is more or less and if I want to have subsurface scattering, the weight is the thing that's going to control how much of whatever's in that section is going to do things. Okay, so first off, that's how you're going to control it from the beginning. Base is the base, what you would expect it to be. So typically I would just go ahead and put this up to 1, not 0.8. But color is color, just like it would be color for a Maya material. Now, the diffuse roughness, what that's going to do is it's going to... oh, my dog. It's going to make the surface more rough. Really what you're trying to do, when you look at a surface and if it's matte, like if you look at a rug and stuff, right, there's a lot of tiny geometry there. So when the light hits it, it spreads that light around, and it doesn't create any kind of specular highlight or any kind of shininess. Okay, so if you make it rough, this will make the surface have more of a pure roughness. Metalness does exactly what it suggests. It makes it look like more metal. If you shove the metalness all the way up, it will look metallic. It'll look like metal. Now, if you have color and you have, like, let's say, red, it'll look like shiny red, like aluminum metal kind of thing, right? Now, specular will do the same thing. If you shove specular all the way up, it will also make it look like metal. But the difference is that when it gets whatever's reflected inside of the specular will be tinted by this color here. Whatever's reflected by the metalness here will be reflected by the color of the object itself. So that's what these are for. Okay. Now specular is the highlight. That's like the shininess of the object. Okay. So obviously the more shiny, the greater the value, the more shiny. If you make it rough, that's obviously going to make it less shiny. This is, what is this called? Index of refraction? Index of refraction? Basically, it's for the Fresnel index value. So the idea here is that certain surfaces, when you stare at them, if you stare at them perpendicular, like let's say through a car window, right? If you stare at a car window looking directly at it, you can see straight through, no problem. But if you were to turn and now the car window is parallel with you, like you're looking to the side of it, you will see the sky, or you'll see things reflected on it. So basically, if you do more of that, that's going to become more prominent. If you do less of it, it's going to be less of it. You can actually, it's actually a value. There's you can look up math, because you remember this is a physically based renderer. So just like that, we had the kelvins for the color temperature. Same thing here. You can actually look up whatever material you have and pump in those numbers, and then you'll know. Anisotropy is basically it's meant to mimic the striations, the micro bands that are created through like brushed metal. Okay, so picture a brushed metal where it instead of a round highlight, it creates a band of a highlight. That's the idea behind it. And then the rotation will control whether it's rotating, one direction or another, because obviously you might want to adjust that. So transmission basically deals with light penetrating and going through the surface. So more or less transparency and translucency. Transparency would be, if you go all the way up, it'll make it 100% transparent. And then you can adjust some of these other things in order to make it scatter and not be more like translucent. But if you really want to make something translucent too, you would probably use the subsurface. And the idea here is it's not light going through the surface, it's light going into the surface and bouncing back out. So for instance, skin, when light hits it, it goes in, it bounces around, it comes out more enriched. And that's why people, especially like a woman's pride, and like, oh, you're glowing. It's because she literally physically has more blood in her system. And so she looks more alive. It's not because, trust me, I don't think she feels more alive. It's because of subsurface scattering, and so she's just more enriched with blood, and so that's the idea behind it. So anyway, that's subsurface scanning. So think of like candle wax or things like that. Things where the light goes in and it feels very, like, I don't want to say warm necessarily, but it's full of color, right? That kind of a thing. So that's subsurface. Or, like you take an egg and you put the light behind it and you can see inside the egg, like that's subsurface. It's the light penetrating it. Okay, so that's what all these do. Now, there are things that you can do with this. I'm just going to open these two up. Now, you can manually go through and punch all these numbers in here, but that's really kind of like difficult. One thing, probably the easiest way to do it, though, is this. If you go up here, I don't know if you ever noticed this, but many of the objects and things inside of Maya actually have these presets. They'll be like focus, blah, blah, blah. You might have never noticed there's a presets button. Most of them don't have actual presets in it, but that button does exist. If you see an asterisk on it, that means there's a preset for that item. Now, often, because I used to use Mental Ray also had presets. So often, like, renderers will have these built into them. Anything that's a plugin for Maya, so like there's, where is it? This XGen thing here. You can make hair and fur. There's presets that when you make the fur, you can click on it and be like gorilla fur, duck fur, whatever. There's a bunch of different presets. Just like those, this also has presets, and it's actually pretty easy. So what you do is like, okay, I'm going to do cloth, right? So I'm going to click on presets, and then you're going to see it has this whole list of all these different things that it could possibly be. Now, unfortunately, none of these look like cloth. So you have to do is kind of like guesstimate what you think would be the closest thing to of what you would want it to be. And kind of, I guess, go from there. So I am going to go with, I don't like any of these. Let's do thin plastic. I guess so we'll thin plastic and then replace. Now you might find like, oh, I want to do something that's kind of like milky, but I also want it to be sparkly. What you could do is I could start with that one and then go frosted glass and blend 50%. So it'll become 50% of the one and 50% of the other. So you can actually mix these as well, which is really nice. Okay, so we did that. I'm just going to use that preset to start with, even though, and what all that does is it literally changes a bunch of these numbers for me without me having to punch them in. So it already knows what the defaults are for that surface type, and then plops them in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and actually apply this tablecloth material to my object. So I'm just going to middle mouse button and drag it onto my object. And I can see that is way off. I don't like that material at all. So I'm going to replace it with a different one. Let's go presets, and I just need something normal. Let's say rubber. Let's do rubber. Okay, let's see what that looks like. Okay, rubber. Oops, that's totally not what I wanted. Get out of there. Okay, so rubber is a little bit better of an approximation, but obviously it's not 100%. Now, you might be like, well, if they don't have the presets in there, you can try to do what you want. But if you go to their website, Solid Angle is the name of the docs.arnoldrenderer.com. Okay, go there, I guess. You can actually go up there, and they will give you. Let's see what I was looking for. You can find the values for materials inside of here. You might be able to find what you're looking for there. Or you could probably go online and look up, like, oh, what would be good settings for a material I'm trying to make. Okay. So I'm going to go down here, and I don't want any specular. So I'm going to take this value of specular. I'm just going to drag that all the way to the left. And that will probably be pretty close to what I want after that, as far as the actual material is concerned, because the specular was the problem. So what I would tell you right off the bat is, when you do use these, is look and see, okay, so base is 100%, which I kind of figured it would be. Transmission is 0, and subsurface is 0. So the only thing it's now using is base, okay? So now I'm going to do is adjust these in order to make this, look the way I want. So obviously I don't want it to be this default gray, crappy looking thing here. So what I'm going to do is go to my color, and I'm going to use a couple of procedural textures and kind of go from there. I'm actually going to stop this video, though, so that it's not too awful long. And when we come back, we are going to start actually applying the materials and stuff onto the thing.